The boy sat by himself at the end of the long banquet table, holding a paper napkin he had folded into the shape of a crane, or something close to it, while around him, 200 guests in evening wear clinked glasses, and congratulated each other on their generosity. His name was Emmett. He was 9 years old, and his father had promised him that tonight was going to be special. It was special, in the way that charity galas always are. The venue was the Fairmont Royal York in downtown Toronto, a building so old and so certain of its own importance that even the air inside felt pressed and formal. The ballroom ceiling was 30 feet high, and hung with chandeliers that caught the candlelight and scattered it across them in small trembling pieces. Every table had white roses, and a card printed with the name of a child, somewhere who would benefit from the evening's donations. Every guest had paid $800 for their seat. The total raised, the MC had announced 20 minutes ago to sustained applause, was a little over $300,000. All of it designated for pediatric rehabilitation programs across Ontario. Emmett had heard the announcement. He had clapped too, because everyone around him was clapping, and because he knew he was supposed to. But his hands had gone still after that, and he had gone back to his paper crane, and no one had noticed either way. His father, Dr. Warren Stanhope, was 44 years old, and one of the most respected pediatric orthopedic surgeons in the country. He had been featured in Maclean's twice. He had been the keynote speaker at the Canadian Orthopedic Association conference, 3 years running. He had rebuilt the hip of a 16-year-old figure skater, who went on to compete at the national level, and the girl's mother had sent him a Christmas card every year since. He was the kind of doctor other doctors mentioned when they were trying to explain what medicine, at its best, could look like. He was also, in ways he had not yet fully understood, a man who had learned to be most comfortable in rooms exactly like this one. Rooms full of purpose and agenda, and measurable outcomes, where the emotional weight of a situation could be translated into a dollar amount and dealt with accordingly. His wife, Carol, had understood this about him. She had loved him anyway, and sometimes she had teased him gently about it over dinner, the way she teased him about only buying dark roast coffee and always being 10 minutes early. She had known how to translate him to the world, and the world to him, in a way that made everything easier for everyone, especially Emmett. Carol had died 22 months ago. Pancreatic cancer, diagnosed in March, gone by November. She was 41 years old. Warren had managed the grief the way he managed most things, with structure, with forward motion, with a series of decisions that needed to be made, and were therefore made. He arranged the funeral, he updated the will. He hired a part-time housekeeper named Mrs. Belanger, who came 3 times a week, and who Emmett had decided he liked because she never tried to make him feel better about things. She just quietly kept the house from falling into chaos, which was, in its own way, a form of love. Warren put himself back to work 6 weeks after Carol died. It was, he told his colleagues, what he needed. What he was less certain of was what Emmett needed, and this uncertainty sat in him like a stone, present and heavy, and rarely examined directly. He brought Emmett to the gala because his colleague had suggested it. Bring him, let him see what the work is for. Kids like that kind of thing. Warren had thought it sounded reasonable. He had pictured Emmett, listening to the speeches, maybe asking questions afterward, maybe even feeling proud of his father, in a way that was concrete and pointed, rather than the vague, inherited pride that children sometimes carried for parents. They didn't quite understand yet. He had not pictured Emmett sitting alone at the end of the table, folding a napkin into the shape of a crane, while Warren worked the room. The thing about Warren was that he never meant to disappear into a crowd. It simply happened to him, the way weather happens. A colleague approached him near the bar, then a donor, who had questions about the new wing at Sick Kids, then a woman from the hospital board, who wanted to discuss a funding proposal, then a journalist, who covered health policy for the Globe and Mail, and who had been trying to get 10 minutes with him for 3 months. The room was full of people who needed something from him, and Warren was constitutionally incapable of being dismissive or rushed. And so he gave each of them his full attention, one after another, while across the ballroom his son sat at an increasingly empty table and waited. Emmett was not the kind of child who cried easily in public. Carol had called him her little stoic, affectionately, and Warren had recognized something of himself in the description. But stoicism in a 9-year-old looks different than it does in an adult. In an adult, it can read as strength. In a child, it looks like a face that has gone very still and very quiet, and eyes that have learned to find something neutral to rest on, so that they do not reveal what is happening inside. Emmett's eyes were resting on the paper crane. He did not look up when the chair beside him was pulled out. He assumed it was one of the waitstaff collecting a place setting. "That's a pretty good crane," said a voice. "The wing fold is tricky, most people give up on that part." Emmett looked up. The man sitting beside him was not a waiter. He was maybe 30 or so. It was hard to tell with adults. And he was wearing a jacket that didn't quite fit the formality of the room. The kind of jacket you buy for occasions that require a jacket, not the kind you have tailored. He had the look of someone who had not been planning to sit down, but had made a decision, and was now committed to it. Beside him, pressed close to his side, was a girl of about 7 or 8 with dark braids and the careful watchful expression of a child who has learned to assess new situations before deciding how to feel about them. "I made it wrong, Mrs. Bed. The beak is too short." "Mine are always lopsided," the man said. He extended a hand, which was a slightly formal thing to do with a 9-year-old but felt right somehow, like the man was taking the conversation seriously. "I'm Griffin, this is my daughter, Adaise. She goes by Ada, mostly." "Emmett," said Emmett. He shook the hand. "Is Ada shy?" "Not usually," Griffin said. He glanced at his daughter. "Are you being shy?" "No," Ada said. Then to Emmett with the directness that certain children possess and most adults have trained themselves out of. "Do you want to see something? I have a game on my dad's phone." This was how it began, not with a grand gesture, not with a speech, but with a phone held out across a banquet table, and a question asked without any ceremony at all. Griffin Osi-Mensah was 38 years old. He worked as a physiotherapist at a community health clinic in Scarborough, the kind of clinic that operated on thin margins and served people who didn't always have other options, and he had worked there for 11 years because he believed in it, even on the days when believing in it was difficult. He had grown up in Brampton, the son of Ghanaian immigrants, who had made their lives in Canada with a combination of discipline and optimism that Griffin had absorbed so completely, he sometimes forgot it wasn't common. His wife, Josephine, had died 3 years ago. She had been 34, an aneurysm, the kind that gives no warning, that arrives and concludes in a matter of hours, leaving the people who loved her standing in a hospital corridor, trying to understand how the world had rearranged itself so completely without their consent. Griffin had been left with Ada, who was 4 at the time, and a 3-bedroom house in Scarborough that felt, for a long while, about twice as large as it needed to be. He had not come to the gala because it was his kind of event. He had come because his clinic was one of the program recipients. A small mention in the printed program, a seat at a table near the back. And because his supervisor had suggested it might be good for the clinic's visibility to have someone there. He had brought Ada because his usual babysitter had a conflict, and because Ada was by this point a seasoned companion for situations that required patience and the ability to entertain herself in adult spaces. She was good at it. She always had been. But Griffin had noticed, when he collected their table assignment at the door, and found them placed near the back of the room, that Ada had scanned the space the way she sometimes did. Quickly. Cataloging, measuring the distance between herself and the rest of the event. And he had felt the familiar small ache that came with understanding exactly what she was doing and why. He had been watching, from their table, when he noticed the boy at the other end of the room. It was the stillness that caught his attention. Griffin was trained to read bodies. It was, literally, his profession, and he could see, from 40 feet away, that the boy at that table had the posture of someone who had been waiting for a long time, and had stopped expecting the wait to end. Head slightly down, shoulders inward, hands occupied with something small and private. Around him, the chairs had gradually emptied, as the room shifted and mingled, and no one had stopped on their way past to say anything to him. Griffin watched for a few minutes, long enough to be certain of what he was seeing. Then he looked at Ada, who was drawing on the back of the program with a pen she had produced from somewhere, and he said, "Hey, want to go sit somewhere else for a bit?" Ada looked up, followed his gaze across the room, looked back at her father with the expression of a child who has spent 3 years learning to read his instincts. "Is that boy by himself?" "Looks like it." She capped her pen. Okay. They crossed the ballroom together, weaving between clusters of guests and white-clothed tables, and Griffin pulled out the chair beside Emmett and sat down, and said what he said about the crane, and then Ada held out the phone, and something shifted. It was not dramatic. There was no music swelling, no moment of revelation, announced by a change in the lighting. Two children sat side by side, and looked at a phone screen together, and Ada said, "Here, you tap this part." And Emmett tapped it, and the thing on the screen did something that made both of them laugh at the same time, and Griffin sat back in his chair and let it happen. He asked Emmett questions, easy ones, the kind that don't require anything too personal. Whether he liked hockey or found it boring the way some kids did. What grade he was in. Whether he'd ever been to the CN Tower observation deck. Emmett had twice, or the ROM, also yes, he liked the dinosaur gallery. Griffin kept his voice level and unhurried, the way he talked to his patients sometimes when he needed them to relax, before something difficult. Emmett began to talk. Not immediately, and not about everything, but gradually, and with increasing ease. He told Griffin that his dad was a doctor, that they lived in Forest Hill, that he used to have a dog named Birch, but Birch had died, which was sad but also a long time ago, so he didn't think about it as much now. He said this last part carefully, with the particular caution of a child who has learned to measure how much sadness is appropriate to disclose to a stranger. Griffin received all of it without reaction. Without the slight flinch or the overcompensating warmth that children can detect immediately, and that tends to make them close back up. He just listened, and nodded, and occasionally said, "Yeah, or that makes sense," in a way that suggested he found Emmett perfectly reasonable company. After a while, he flagged down a server and asked if they could get 2 Shirley Temples, which Ada immediately announced was her favorite drink, and which Emmett said he had never had, which led Ada to a brief but intense speech about the importance of grenadine. They drank the Shirley Temples. They ordered a third one, for Griffin, to Ada's theatrical approval. Across the room, Warren had moved on to a conversation with the hospital's chief development officer. A woman named Paulette, who had very clear opinions about naming rights and the long-term vision for the pediatric wing, and Warren was listening carefully and giving her his complete professional attention, while somewhere in the back of his mind, a small alarm was beginning to sound, quiet and persistent. The way alarms sound when you first become aware of them, and haven't yet decided whether they require action. He glanced toward the table where he had left Emmett. The table was almost empty. A few guests sat at the far end, deep in conversation, and at the very end of the table, in the seat where Emmett had been, there was Emmett. But there was also a man Warren didn't recognize, and a little girl with dark braids, and the three of them appeared to be laughing at something on a phone screen, and Emmett had the expression Warren had not seen in. He had to think about this. Months, maybe longer. Warren excused himself from Paulette. He crossed the room slowly, telling himself he was simply going to check in. That this was a routine check-in, and not an acknowledgement of anything uncomfortable. But by the time he reached the table, he had stopped telling himself that, because the rational part of his mind had already completed the calculation, and arrived at the answer he didn't want. He had left Emmett alone for over an hour. He stood at the end of the table for a moment, before anyone noticed him. Emmett was showing Griffin something on the phone, explaining it with more animation than Warren had seen from him in recent memory. And Griffin was leaning forward with genuine interest, and Ada was watching them both, with the satisfied expression of someone who has successfully introduced 2 people, and is pleased with the result. Then Emmett looked up and saw his father, and something complicated moved across his face. Not accusation, not exactly, but something adjacent to it, the expression of a child who has just been reminded of something he had for a little while, successfully forgotten. "Dad," he said, "this is Griffin, and Ada. Griffin knows origami. Real origami, not the napkin kind." Warren looked at Griffin, who had stood, which was a slightly formal thing to do but also considerate, and extended his hand. "Griffin Osi Mensa," he said, "your son's good company." Warren shook his hand. He said his own name. He sat down, because it seemed like the right thing to do, even though sitting down at this particular table at this particular moment felt like an admission of something. What he noticed, in the next few minutes, was that Emmett kept talking. This was not unusual in itself. Emmett had never been a particularly quiet child, but the quality of it was different. He was relaxed in a way that Warren associated with home, with Friday evenings, with the particular low-key ease of days when nothing was required of anyone. He leaned toward Ada when he talked to her. He looked at Griffin directly when Griffin said something. Without the slight sideways wariness that Warren had noticed, creeping into Emmett's interactions with adults over the past 2 years, Warren sat and watched this, and felt something move through him that was not quite guilt, and not quite grief, but was related to both, the feeling of recognizing something true that you have been successfully not looking at for a very long time. He had built Emmett's life with great care: private school, extracurricular programs, a comfortable home, a housekeeper who kept things running, therapy, which Emmett attended every 2 weeks, and which Warren believed in the way he believed in most evidence-based interventions. He had, by any reasonable external measure, managed their situation well. What he had not managed, could not manage in the way you manage a schedule or a professional relationship, was the simple fact that he was often somewhere else, not physically, necessarily, but in the more essential sense. Occupied, attended elsewhere, moving through the important work of his professional life, while Emmett moved through the important work of being 9 years old. And the two of them operating mostly in parallel, rather than in genuine contact with each other. Carol had been the bridge. She had known how to close the distance between them. Had done it so naturally that Warren had never fully understood it was happening until it stopped. He was understanding it now, sitting at the end of a banquet table, while his son laughed at something Ada was showing him, and he felt the understanding settle into him with the slow, unwelcome weight of something that cannot be unfelt once it has arrived. Griffin caught Warren's eye, briefly, across the table. He did not say anything. He did not need to. He just gave a small nod. The kind that acknowledges something without making a production of it. And then he turned back to whatever Ada was explaining, and the moment passed. Later, when the dessert was being served and the tables had grown quieter, Warren leaned toward Emmett and asked a question he had not asked in a while. "Are you doing okay tonight?" Emmett considered this with the seriousness he applied to most questions. "Better now," he said. "Griffin said Ada could teach me origami, like real shapes. She can make a fox." "That's impressive," Warren said. "She said she'd show me. Can we do it sometime?" Warren looked at Griffin, who had heard and was waiting, without any particular expectation, for whatever Warren decided. "Yeah," Warren said. "We can do that." The gala ended at 11. The MC made a final announcement. The ballroom began its slow, graceful process of emptying. Guests gathered their coats and their conversations and moved toward the exit in clusters. Still talking, still doing the work of a room like this. Emmett stood beside Warren and held his folded crane. Griffin and Ada stopped on their way out. Ada handed Emmett a slightly crumpled piece of paper. The program from the event, on the back of which she had drawn what appeared to be a fox in 3 stages of origami completion, with small arrows indicating the folds. "In case you forget," she said. Emmett took the paper and looked at it carefully. "I won't forget," he said, "but I'll keep it anyway." Ada nodded, with the gravity of a transaction concluded fairly. Warren shook Griffin's hand again. He said the standard things: "It was nice to meet you," thank him for, and then he stopped, because the standard things were not quite right for what he actually wanted to say, and after a moment he said, simply, "Thank you, for sitting with him." Griffin looked at him. "He's a good kid," he said. "He just needed someone to sit down." It was a simple sentence. It was also the most precise thing anyone had said to Warren in months. He thought about it on the drive home, while Emmett sat in the back seat with the program in his lap, and his head, tipping toward the window, fighting sleep in the way of children, who refuse to admit they are tired. The city moved past outside, the lights of the Gardiner, the orange and white of street lamps on Lakeshore, the particular amber dark of a Toronto night in October, and Warren thought about the sentence, and what it meant, and what it required of him. He did not arrive at any large conclusions that night. That is not how these things work, in real life. In real life, the understanding comes first, and the change comes after, slowly, in accumulated small decisions that are each individually unremarkable, but which add up, over time, to something different. In the weeks after the gala, Warren began leaving the hospital earlier on Thursdays. Not every Thursday, He was a surgeon, with a full schedule and obligations that were real and significant, but more Thursdays than before. He started coming home in time to eat dinner with Emmett at the kitchen table, without a phone beside his plate, without the half-presence that had become their default. He started asking different kinds of questions, not how was school, but what was the most annoying thing that happened today. Because Emmett answered the second kind much more thoroughly. He also, on a Saturday morning in early November, took Emmett to a community origami workshop at the Scarborough branch of the Toronto Public Library, where Griffin volunteered twice a month. Ada was there. She was, as advertised, very good at foxes. Emmett was not, initially, also good at foxes, but he improved significantly over the course of 2 hours, and by the end he had something that was recognizable as a fox if you tilted your head slightly, and he was deeply pleased with it. They went for bubble tea afterward, all 4 of them, at a place on Shepherd that Ada declared was the best one in the entire city. A claim she made with the absolute authority of someone who has done thorough research. Warren watched Emmett and Ada argue about which flavor was objectively superior. Emmett maintaining the position of taro, Ada holding firm for lychee, and felt something loosen in his chest that had been held tight for a very long time. It was not a dramatic feeling, it was not a revelation in the cinematic sense. It was quieter than that, and more permanent. The feeling of something returning, that had been absent long enough that you had stopped noticing its absence, and that you now recognized, retrospectively, as the thing that makes the rest of it make sense. Warren had spent 2 years believing that love, in its most responsible form, looked like provision, like structure, like showing up to a charity gala and knowing the name of every board member and raising $300,000 for children who needed it. All of that was real, none of it was wrong. But provision without presence is an architecture without warmth. Beautiful perhaps, functional, and empty in ways that take a long time to name. Emmett had named it, without words, with the expression on his face when his father finally sat down beside him. And Griffin had named it, with 11 words at the end of a banquet table in Toronto, a sentence short enough to fit in a pocket, and sturdy enough to carry for a lifetime. He just needed someone to sit down. It cost nothing. It changes everything. And somehow, in all our busyness, in all our important work and necessary conversations and measurable outcomes, it remains the thing we most often fail to do, and the thing that, when we finally manage it, turns out to have been available all along.